I actually first met Connie, when was it, last year? At the Tiger author speed dating thing?
Yes.
And here she is, as one of us now. We've assimilated her. Connie Carmichael. Oh, we are bored. You gotta get that right. Connie Carmichael. You're recording this, you gotta start over. Connie Carmichael Hill moved to Oregon in 1969 and even loves the area's rain. She raised 2 daughters alone, and after being laid off from a large electronic company, that Intel company, found her passion at Portland's new Renaissance bookshop. At the bookstore, she spent 12 years coordinating events with spiritual authors and teachers. While at the bookstore, she had the pleasure of meeting and exercising her nosy bone, interviewing 45 well-known spiritual teachers for a local alternative newspaper. Connie has also helped hundreds make drums and rattles, and lots of others make personal changes with astrology. Let's make some noise for Connie.
So I'm supposed to bring this up too? Oh. So my book is Money Stories. And can you hear me?
Close.
Can you hear me now?
Better.
Better? Okay. This is my book, Money Stories, and it's a series of interviews that I did while I was working at the bookstore with a number of spiritual teachers. So what I want to do, my money story started when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and you know, I thought, what makes some people have a lot of money and other people not have very much, and some struggle and so on. And so I started thinking about what that whole process was. Anyway, I realized that my time at that started when I was about 4 or 5. What happened, my parents were arguing one Sunday after church. We were sitting at the dinner table, and my mother picked up a bowl of peas and threw them at my dad. And that is my first money story memory in my life. Those struggles with money that I got from my family continued, and they continued through my life, and I sort of, you know, I wondered, why is this? So I started asking people, you know, how does money work in your life? And I'm really curious, and so I, you know, talk to people and ask them questions and so on. So I'm going to just start reading. I have a number of parts in my book marked. So the first part is the introduction. And okay, so though I struggled with money most of my life, I've always had a deep belief that if a person was in their right livelihood, or expressed faith or trust, or really knew spirit or God, or whatever you want to call that you know, whatever the word was that you had for that being, that miraculously everything would fall into place. Those people would have what they needed. On the one hand, that belief feels like magical thinking. But on the other hand, I've also seen it work for people. A few years ago, I decided to go on a journey to prove this belief, or to prove either that it did work or didn't work. And that's where this book came from. Through 16 interviews about money and life, or money and spirituality, I began to see life in new and different ways. What I found was that most people I interviewed didn't necessarily know what they knew until I asked them. And once they started talking, they knew. All had a sense of spirituality though they didn't necessarily call it that. Some people called it happiness, or other people called it not worrying. Some called it letting go of resentment, and others just called it their personal story. About half of the people said that though having money was important, it was not the top of their value list. Some were comfortable with money and had a sense of trust that where they were led was where they needed to be, and that the resources they needed were available to them. And I found the people that I interviewed were people that I knew when I worked at the bookstore, or some of them were, but I just started talking to people. So I want to, one of the stories, and I have a little bit that I want to read from several of the stories, but one of the stories is called Creating Your Own Reality. And this person that I interviewed is named Pam Osley. She's a color psychic who has practice down in Santa Barbara. And my daughter and I had been to her for readings several times. And I thought, well, I really would like to have her as one of the interviews in my book. And one of the reasons for that is that she's the first person that told me about, 20 years ago, that I would write a book. And I thought, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Anyway, I guess she did know what she was talking about. So in this, I asked her to tell me how money and spirituality worked in her life. And she said they're not disconnected for her. And then she said, let's see, everything is energy and consciousness, including money. And one of her favorite meditation exercises is to visualize money floating down around her, landing in big piles. Every time I do this exercise, she said, cash shows up in my life. Once, a man I'd never met found my book, read it, and sent me 100,000 shares of his new company. The company was brand new, but later the shares ended up being worth $10,000. So I received $10,000 from a complete stranger. I told some friends who were really hurting for money about this exercise, and they did it every night for 5 or 10 minutes. They'd sit on their bed and visualize money floating down around them. A few weeks later, the wife got called to a game show. She loved game shows. And in an hour, she won $25,000. They were amazed at how well it worked and how quickly. This exercise allowed Pam, to release the belief that by having money, she was taking money away from others. The energy showed up out of the ethers, out of the sky, and takes whatever form she needed. Another person that I interviewed is a woman who is a local astrologer, and her name is Maridel Bose. And she and I, she was introduced to me by someone else, another one of the people that I interviewed, and we got to be really good friends. And actually, I met her before she even moved to Oregon, but she had this wonderful story that she told about teaching herself to stop worrying. And I decided that I needed to have that story for my book. So I asked her, I said, let's talk about how money works in your life. You told me that you had made a decision to stop worrying about money. How did you do that? So I thought worrying is part of life, And anyway, she said, it was one of those routine moments. I was on the way to Trader Joe's one day, and I realized I was worrying about whether I had enough money for my purchases. At that point, I had an epiphany that I had worried about money all my life, and yet provision had always been there, often well beyond my needs. At that point, it was apparent that worrying was useless and served no purpose. It wasn't contributing anything positive, and in fact was detrimental. Trips to Trader Joe's have always been fun, but if I was worrying, the trips weren't enjoyable. So I decided to teach myself to stop worrying. If I'm okay in the moment, and I was, in reflection and always had been, why give up the experience of not being okay? That was the basis of my learning to stop worrying. I kept coming back to that notion of being okay right now and asking why it would be any different in 5 minutes or 5 days. When larger challenges came up, I found the same principles worked. As you know, when embarking on something new, challenges come up and test the new thoughts or the new ideas. Sometimes I need to touch into the feeling of being okay several times in an hour. But what I found was that even if the challenge was formidable, worrying still didn't help. It was foolish to worry about money even when there was a sense that I might not be okay, like the scary time my partner Johnny lost his job. And it was up to me to create all of our funds. And she was an astrologer, so, if you do things like that, you don't always know what your, how many readings and so on are going to come in. But anyway, she said, worry contributed nothing. If I worried, I took away my capacity to create a solution, not from my head, but from my spirit. So anyway, she goes along and talks about how accepting that new viewpoint and really working with worrying and letting go of worrying really increased how provision was in her life. So another story, and this is, I think, these are all like my babies. So each of the stories, you could read the book and pick it up and read a different story, and it's not like you've missed a whole lot if you start at the end and then pick up in the middle. But as I was saying, this story, a lot of times I think of as one of my favorites, even though all of them are my babies, and I can't say that one's my favorite. But this is the story of a friend of mine named Carol. And I met her when I worked at the bookstore, and then she moved to North Carolina. And she ran a bed and breakfast there for a number of years and decided that she wanted to buy the cabins that were just down the block, and because of some things that were going on. And so anyway, this is the story of her getting the money for the cabins. She says, getting the financing is the interesting part of my story. My B&B was far enough out of town that I didn't get drop-in traffic, but one Tuesday, after working 16 days straight, I decided to take the night off since we didn't have any reservations for the night. I was opening a bottled wine when the doorbell rang. A young man in his 30s was there wanting a room. And I told him that I was taking the night off and there was a nice B&B down the road. But he said he had heard about my B&B and really wanted to stay with me. Carol tried to talk him into going someplace else 3 times. And finally she said, okay, give me a minute and I'll get a room ready for you. We ended up chatting all evening. He was from the Florida Keys and had come to attend an organic foods conference. We talked about life, our philosophies, and it was just a wonderful evening. During our conversation, I talked about the cabins, and just before the evening ended, he said, Carol, why don't I loan you the money? The title of this chapter is called An Angel at My Door. She says, I was aghast and said, you don't know me from Adam. Why would you even think such a thing? His reply was, I think I do know you, and I'm serious. Sure that the morning would change his mind, I suggested we sleep on it, and we headed to our rooms. But the next morning, he wanted to see the property. "Are you really sure about this? It's a considerable amount of money, and I don't want to offend you, but where does your money come from?" He told her that he had just sold a business in Texas, and he had been considering putting the money in the stock market or buying other property, but would rather invest in me. We decided to think about it for a week, and at the end of the week, I emailed him and said he was off the hook if he wanted to change his mind, but he didn't. What a spiritual gift. A guardian angel knocks on my door, and I try to turn him away 3 times. So Carol goes on and talks more about how money works in her life and so on. And then the last thing that I want to read is at the end there's a chapter called Closing, and I have 4 insights that I got from doing this process. So insight number 2 is money versus enough. This insight is about money versus enough, and my story around these. For over half of my life, my story was that I needed more to be okay. More money, more things, more time, more happiness, more of everything. Enough was not a concept I understood. I saw the struggles I was having and what I didn't have, not what I had. A gift from this book is about gratitude. I'm amazed at how much I've had and not been grateful for. Replacing need or wanting more with gratitude has changed my personal story, from don't have to knowing I'll be supported. I've learned that fulfillment comes from enough, not more. We don't gain access to anything by wanting and needing more, because in that position we're always striving for that more. I've found that I need to change my focus to see the blessings of enough and to have gratitude for that. Seeing that I have enough and having gratitude are now my daily practice. So before I close, each of the chapters includes a paragraph at the end where I ask questions like, let me see here on Carol's chapter. What I do is these are things to think about after you've read the chapter. Do you find it easy to take time to yourself? Do you play, vacation, take time off? This is a time to focus on yourself, allowing only, or do you only take time for yourself after you've done everything? And as one of the people say in her story, she had always thought that no, she couldn't ever take time off. She had to get everything done first, and she realized that when that was the way it was, she never took time off. She never had time for herself. So anyway, there are things to think about at the end. And thank you very much for letting me read to you.
Thank you.